Oh, there he is. Besides being treasurer of the Cal SFS for another term too, is going to give the presentation for Chuck Hawkins. Now Chuck, like I mentioned, was here 25 years ago, and what he presented on at that time was the work he was doing in California. So his involvement in bioassessment goes back 30 years in California. He is a professor at Utah State now, but he has done a lot of work for us in getting bioassessment going in California. John's going to explain all that anyway, I'm sure. I didn't look at his presentation, but I'm sure he's going to do it. John was a grad student with Chuck, has known him for a long time. He's now a professor at the University of Monterey, California, Monterey, they call it. It's a fairly new university, and he's getting started. So I'll let him come up and give his presentation for Chuck.
Thanks, Jim. So Chuck and I have been working together for, next year it'll be 20 years. So I've known Chuck almost as long as he's been coming here to see. So as you heard, I've just been giving Chuck's talk. Unfortunately, some of the humor is not going to come off quite the same. It's really funny and Chuck jokes, but I'll do my best. So to start off with, most of you probably heard that Chuck was born here in California, but you probably don't know where. So he came from a town called Argaba, just south of Marysville. There's two Argabas in the world apparently. There's one in Sweden, and then there's another one here in California. And there's a YouTube clip there that I was going to play for you, but it's hard to bring up. Basically, it says two people from Sweden Argaba, visiting the Argaba here. They're pretty thoroughly creeped out. They saw Argaba as being a very rough neighborhood. And this is sort of the environment that Chuck grew up in. But it was close to the Feather River, so he was able to basically ride his bike down to the Feather River pretty much every day after school and spend time messing around the rivers, catching fish, and doing things that boys do in rivers. And ultimately, they ended up, the living close to the rivers has a double-edged sword. And he ended up having his, in '55, when he was 4 years old, he actually ended up having to go and stay at a Boy Scout camp for a few days during a flood. And eventually, in '97, the flood managed to take out his mother's house. But after his boyhood, growing up, he wanted to become a baseball player and play for Stanford. So that's what his dream was. But he didn't really have a plan on how to make that happen at the time, so he ended up going to Sacramento State. Changed his major about 5 times, eventually settled on chemistry, which he stayed as a chemistry major up to the last semester, and changed off to biology the last second. He, after getting his BA with a pre-med degree, he basically stayed on at Sacramento State, working for Rollo Darby, an early midge guy, helping him do aquatic bugs, and eventually got his master's there at Sacramento State. From there, he went off to Davis in '75, and he was there for only 2 quarters when he realized his Davis PhD program was not what he was cut out for. So he gave that up. And in '76, he ended up applying for a job as a technician at Oregon State University. So Jim Siddell had hired him at that point to come work on what he later found out was the River Continuum project. So he packed up his BW, drove up to Corvallis, stayed up there for 2 years working for Jim on this project as a technician until the funding finally ran out. And when that happened, he decided Oregon State was a much better fit for him than Davis was. So he stayed on and started a PhD program there, working for Norm Anderson. With Norm, he was looking at a comparative ecology of ephemeral mayflies. And that was a pretty thinly funded project. So he ended up working on a lot of different other side projects. And one of the big side projects we worked on was looking at the effects of sediment riparian cover on stream communities. And I think that's where he met Jim. He was basically reflecting, I thought that was when you guys met, was probably in
Redwood National Park.
National Park, yeah, the Redwood National Park, when he was down there doing field work for that project. So as part of that project, they went in and sampled, pairs of sites, measuring both canopy cover and fine sediment cover. And basically finding, one of his major findings out of that work was the fact that riparian cover didn't necessarily always relate to what you saw with the ephemeral and mayflies. After he completed his PhD, he actually moved to Utah State, where he started as an assistant professor, thinking he was going to be there for a couple of years and move on from there. And also at this time, he wasn't really thinking about bioassessment. Bioassessment was not really a word in his vocabulary. But he ended up staying there for 10 years and working on a bunch of different projects that actually basically helped him reconnect with California. So these are the four major projects he worked on between 1993 and 1993. He did a project with Joe Furnish up in Region 5, looking at snails as grazers. He's pretty well known for his work looking at the effects of Mount St. Helens as a disturbance on stream systems and how stream systems recover from such a large disturbance. But the one that really probably influenced the most was the work he did with Lynn Decker, looking at the cumulative watershed effects associated with forest management. This cumulative watershed effects was a project that was jointly funded by both Region 5 of the Forest Service as well as the California Department of Forestry. And its design was to go out and sample 45 different watersheds, basically organized into groups of 3, so 15 separate groups of 3, where one was chosen to have little or no impact, one was chosen to have moderate impact, and one was chosen to have high impact in terms of forest management practices. But each group of 3 was supposed to have very little natural gradients, so basically control for natural gradients within each group. And then they sampled across this relatively large area, going from up the Northern California coast, up across to Modoc, and all the way down the Sierras. So they had this wide range of natural variation they were measuring, in addition to the management practices they were looking at. So altogether, they sampled almost 700 different rivers and pools across this entire area. And most of the management effects that they were examining were not necessarily, complete clear cuts, but modifications of riparian areas and nutrient inputs and sediment inputs associated with the roads. So when we started working on this data set, they had all these almost 700 riffle samples from 45 mountain basins. So one of the analysis they did was to compare invertebrates they found at the control or reference sites to the managed areas. And we were hoping they could detect, some obvious changes between what you saw in terms of invertebrates at a site that was relatively unimpaired compared to a paired site. So after they went through and did this analysis, Chuck was going to go off and present it. So he decided he would take this at NABS, North American Association, North American Biological Society, which is now Society of Professional Science in Orlando. So he was going to give his talk, and he thought he would end up probably, in the disturbance, one of the disturbance talks, or perhaps in community ecology. But they put his talk over in bioassessment, and he didn't really know anything about bioassessment at the time. He had not done anything. Rarely ever heard about it. But he thought, okay, no problems. So he was going to talk about the fact that they were not seeing much in the way of a management effect in terms of looking at how they looked at invertebrates. You know, he tried to use some of the new metrics that people were talking about using to actually detect impairment, things like percent EPT. And they didn't show much response between the managed sites and the reference sites within his data set. And so he's not seeing any systemic responses by bugs or fish. And basically natural gradients were swamping out whatever signal he had, as he was basically sampling from the north coast all the way down through the southern Sierras. And then this happened. Basically found himself in the middle of what was the index wars. You know, basically the moderator at that point basically stood up and said, "Shut the door. No one leaves until we figure out what he said." And other people started yelling at him at that point about him basically betraying the bioassessment programs. And after people were finished yelling at him and he was trying to leave, he stepped outside the door, and there's another group waiting for him outside the door, including Richard Norris and Roger Green, who basically attacked him from the other side, saying he wasn't hard enough on them. He should talk more about these natural gradients. And he's just trying to figure out what the heck he just got into. He was pretty surprised by the whole thing. Only later, when Susan Jackson pulled him aside and started explaining what bioassessment was about, and explaining what he actually did to cause all this fury, he began to understand what happened. So what happened next is probably predictable, but he kind of got bitten by the bioassessment bug and trying to figure out, okay, so he showed these problems that multimetric indices were not working, but he didn't actually have a solution to his problem, right? He thought what bioassessment was trying to do was an important thing, but he basically showed that the MMIs were not sufficient, but he didn't have a better idea. So at that point, Richard Norris at that same time offered him to come to Australia for a 3-month study leave. And that seemed like a really great chance to learn bioassessment from somebody doing it in a different place like Australia. Australia made it easy to say yes. Richard made it a little more difficult, but Richard was still somebody which I could deal with. If I got that Richard and Chuck got along quite well. Before going down to Canberra, though, he was actually invited to give an extended version of his talk at the University of Washington. There he got beat up for a couple more days for his poorly analyzed and very poorly supported science. But when he got down there, he started looking at ODE as observed and expected index as a way of doing bioassessment. He really liked the idea of the fact that it was very intuitive and very simple to understand. You basically figured out what you're expected to observe at any one site, and you're expecting, you compare that to what you actually see. This makes it a nice intuitive index in terms of ways of measuring disturbance. And the fact that ODE already incorporates modeling and natural gradients seemed to be, to him, addressing some of the problems we were having with multimetric indices. So when he was done, he basically took the California watershed effects data that he had and applied the ODE methodology to it. And here on the top part of the table here, we're showing you comparing the ODE and MMI for reference and managed systems. And basically, you can see the ODE is definitely responding to management, where the MMI was not, as he shown earlier. And now at the bottom, you're looking at these two different ecoregions he sampled across, both North Coast and Sierra Nevada. ODE was fairly insensitive to these differences in environments, where MMIs were very sensitive to these changes in environment. In addition to this, it didn't really matter where you drew the line in terms of saying something was impaired or not. By using the ODE approach, you always ended up having more of these managed sites that were being classified as impaired sites than using the MMI approach. Usually anywhere from 3 times more sites to 32 times more sites, you basically declare as not meeting reference conditions using the ODE approach. So this is basically the analysis that ended up basically launching in the next 18 years of his career. He's going through and refining RIFPAX models and trying to expand models beyond invertebrates. So now he's done modeling with using diatoms, fish, lakes, and wetlands. And he's actually even moved back into multimetric indices and actually helped develop ways to incorporate natural gradients inside MMIs. The watershed effects watershed effects project continued to actually bear fruit. Part of their analysis was looking at the effects of different stressors, and one of the major stressor gradients was, of course, temperature across this area. So looking at some of the temperature data they had, there on the top in orange, basically highlight the temperature data, mins and maxes, and basically see a wide range of daily differences in daily mean temperatures, as well as maximums and the actual ranges. And there was also a wide range across these data sets in terms of environmental conditions. And you would have thought with a percent shading ranging from 17 to 90%, the percent recurring shading should have some way of helping you predict the amount of temperature changes you see in these different systems. You expect some sort of correlation. Well, when they actually looked, basically percent recurring shading, basically had R squared of 0 in terms of mean daily temperatures, and only explained 20% of the variation within the range of daily temperatures. But when they actually went and looked at all the other factors they measured, they found that the percent channels as pools, so the proportion of that section they were measuring as pools, actually had a great deal of explanatory power in terms of what was being measured in temperature-wise. They interpret this as basically being that it says you have more pools in the system retains water longer, you basically have just a longer period of time for this stream to heat the water or as it's moving downstream. And they found that the invertebrate composition was very strongly associated with temperature, especially when based on presence-absence data or biomass data. The density data was less interpretable and way weaker patterns. You can notice that in terms of the far left ordination showing you the relationship between density and invertebrate patterns. At this point, though, essentially a light bulb went off, and you started realizing you probably also need to start modeling environmental gradients too, not just modeling including the environment in our models of the invertebrates, actually trying to model the actual environment itself, because we can only measure the environment so well. So to actually predict aquatic life reference conditions, we actually need to predict what the environmental reference conditions for this are. So this led to a paper that Chuck I and Ryan Hill wrote, basically documenting our ability to basically describe the chemistry, flow, temperature, and sediment conditions using a modeling approach to actually help describe the reference condition in terms of each of these environmental factors. And during all this time, we were developing all these different models. He had help by several grad students besides myself. That includes Ryan Hill there in the lower left, Sulichan Dungal in the upper right, who helped do some of our hydrology work, and Jake Vanderlyn, who's currently at Utah DNR, who helped did both looking at the hydraulic regime as well as lake temperatures. So central to all this modeling was the idea that he's trying to figure out ways of producing ever better and more precise models, because he understands that imprecise models lead to poor ability to detect impairment. So this is what has really been the focus of his work for the last 25 years, is actually trying to improve the accuracy and precision of these models. So both diagrams here are demonstrating two different ways of actually measuring precision and accuracy of a model. You can just plot observed to expected, as shown on the left, or plot the ratio of observed to expected, which you expect that to be 1 for reference sites, as shown on the right. And the wider these ODE values get, the more variability you have, the less precise the model. So trying to figure out ways of making the precision of these ODE indices is something he's spent a lot of time working on. He sees a lot of variation as he's done models from across the United States. This is basically showing you some of the standard deviations of different models from different states. With North Carolina being down there, it's one of the best models he's ever produced. Basically, you can figure out and compare these models based on replicant sample variability to determine what's the theoretical best model you can produce. And then you compare that to a null model, which is like the worst model you can produce. And basically, we're seeing the models used for states are almost expanding the entire range between the best possible and the worst possible model. With most of them down there near the best model. You know, even Nevada ended up having a relatively poor model. And we spent a lot of time in the lab talking about why this might be the case. Is it just sampling error? So we went to finding data sets with higher sample densities, or was it just reference site quality, so we can go through and remove poor quality reference sites and see if that will improve models? Was it our ability to predict? The predictors we had in the model had the wrong predictors. So we went through and some of these we actually ended up improving models, but not all of them. So he continued to look and kind of come across the idea that he's been working on lately, looking at the idea of the fact that as connectivity between systems declines, our ability to predict those communities decreases. So metacommunity theory basically predicts that as convergence become more dispersal limited, they're going to be less dominated by species sorting or niche processes. Niche processes are going to have a much more greater impact on systems that are much better connected. So we wanted to investigate this because it's an important factor. When we think about these, how these stream systems communities are organized, we often approach it from a filtering approach where you have a regional species pool that then feeds into a set of environmental factors that define that niche, and then determine what you find in any given system. But this dispersal limitation, unless we can account for that dispersal limitation, that's basically another filter we're not accounting for that's going to change how this work in the system, and our ability to actually predict what should be the community we see for any given stream. So we explored this idea using data from the National Rivers and Stream Assessment, which was over 1,300 sites scattered across the U.S., in which they collected over almost 1,300 different taxa. And what he did with this data set is he went through and developed ODE models, both for the entire nation as a whole, but as well as across 37 different ecoregions. So we had ecoregionally specific models. And for each of these ecoregions, he went through and then calculated that the standard deviation of that ODE score for each one of those models. And using that standard deviation basically as a measurement of the precision of the model. And then he basically modeled that precision as a function of regional drainage density, flow metrics, and productivity, because these are factors metacommunity theory predicts should have some impact. And basically, he saw a twofold variation across regions in model precisions. Basically, running from 0.16 up to 0.31, which is roughly the same range we saw across our state models. And then we looked at the model in terms of what factors are actually important in explaining this variation. It was basically seeing that drainage density was the most important factor. Where as drainage density increases, you basically see drops in the standard deviation of these models. And productivity had the second most important factor, with total nitrogen basically as a surrogate for productivity within the system. As that increases, you basically see an increase in the standard deviation. And then when you go back and look at these data for the state models he's built, you notice a distinct trend that the wetter states like North Carolina, Washington, Oregon, and the Mid-Atlantic Highlands all tend to have much more precise models because they have higher drainage densities and they're more connected. Where the dry sites like California, Arizona, and Nevada tend to have high standard deviations. So that's kind of where he's been at now. He's really enjoyed his California-based work, and he's continued to have more work in California. Right now he's working on characterizing aquatic life with a project with Darren Carlisle of the USGS, where they're looking at both environmental DNA and comparing that to samples collected by traditional methods. And he also has, Chuck and I are working on a project looking at amphibians across the central coast of California and trying to develop a decision-based support system or DoD lands to manage them better for these threatened and endangered species. But he's still interested in broad topics like global climate change and revisiting thermal ecology, trying to better understand some of the regional and local dynamics that causes the desalinization. But he wanted to say that he really enjoyed the fact that he's been coming here, and he really wish he could have been here. And his last, well, two last comments he had were, one, he hopes to join us, get back on track here soon, with myself, go Dodgers. And he also wanted to point out the fact that, his life in bioassessment was not what he had planned. We would encourage anybody that has a, when life throws you a curveball, to go with it, and it's really worked out well for him. Thank you, and I'll take any questions I might be able to answer on Chuck's behalf.
No.
Okay.
There.
Why the frowny face next to California?
Wait a minute, we have to record the question. Just in case.
So why the frowny face?
So Chuck is working on the state science board, helping develop the swamp. And it requires a lot of meetings that he's not particularly fond of.
Welcome to California.